Good morning. This is the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It's Wednesday, April 12th, and this morning we're picking up work on S-17, an act relating to sheriff reforms. Today we're taking testimony from a number of folks with thoughts about the bill and just kind of getting some general feedback about the bill as it came over from the Senate, potential ideas for us to consider as we work on the bill. We're starting off with Sheriff Mark Anderson, so thanks for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Committee, Andrea. For the record, Mark Anderson, Windham County Sheriff, and I am here in my capacity as the president of the Vermont Sheriff's Association. Mr. Chair, I can testify in two ways. One way is about what we think should be reforms, and one way is about our response to S-17 as written. I know you have other witnesses. Do you have a preference?
I think what I would say is that if you have ideas for us to consider about what we should be doing in the context of the bill that we're looking at, that's probably the way I would lean. I think we'll dive into what's in the bill more once we're working with legislative counsel. But I think today I kind of want to hear from folks in the context of the bill that's before us. You know, where should we really be going? What are the things we should be focusing on? If there are things we should be doing differently or in addition.
Great. So I'm going to start off with an experience from my childhood. When I would hurt myself, my father was a doctor. I would hurt myself, and I would go to him saying it hurts. And he would say, when I have a carpenter come to me saying, "Doc, my thumb hurts," what do you think I tell him? Don't hit it with the hammer. So frequently my father would tell me, don't hit it with the hammer as the metaphor for whatever dumb injury I caused myself. And we basically look at it as treating the symptom versus treating the cause. The Vermont Sheriff's Association came into this legislative session understanding there's opportunity for reform. Last week when I testified, we talked about the definition of reform as improving the system. We developed 3 problem statements over events that occurred over the last, at that time, 6 months, basically starting in July 2022. The first problem statement was the community does not feel safe when a person is in an elected position, such as the sheriff, has committed a crime against the victim or the department. Second problem statement is the statutory construct of where sheriffs fall within governance and funding is incredibly complex, leading to frustration when services are needed and aren't available. And the third problem statement is the system under which the legislature intended sheriffs to be compensated is outdated. S-17 attempts to address several symptoms. It doesn't really go to the underlying cause. I've submitted written testimony. I apologize it came this morning. It's out in my drafts, but you do have this document. I will not read it in full. As a quick outline, the document goes on to explain some of the foundational concepts of sheriffs. It talks about our funding systems. It talks about why we do what we do. And I'll leave that to you. But I'm going to speak more specifically to 3 things. First off, I know you're hearing from the judiciary. Today, we've been working with the judiciary. The perspective that the Sheriff's Association has is that we agree that we want to have deputy sheriffs in courthouses to support court operations. There's a lot of nuance to that conversation, and there's a study that's a part of S-17 is currently written. We would ask that the judiciary be added as a member of the study because we believe that there's an opportunity to fully develop a solution to the underlying cause of what's happened in our courts as it pertains to security. We've talked to the auditor's office, and there's some improvements for audits. We come into that with some minor hesitation, only because we're concerned that there's no upper limit on what an auditor could do. I'm not saying that we have an issue with what the auditor has done. They have treated us well. Many of the improvements that they offer in S-17, we think are reasonable. We just want to make sure we're not caught with an unanticipated $100,000 bill. If a forensic accountant, an attorney, and several investigators were needed to go look at something, as it's written right now, the sheriff is responsible for paying for that. So there's concerns there, but broadly, what the auditor's office has presented, I think we're okay with. The Sheriff's Association is okay with a study committee to examine a variety of the complexities of what sheriffs in Vermont currently are, the funding systems for them, and how things are operated, because it is unique across the country. There's not an organization like us elsewhere. At the same time, when we look across the country, we talk with many sheriffs who say we have similar problems of what Vermont is dealing with. So this also isn't new, but we are unique in that we don't really have a true construct of county government. I think there's opportunity to talk about what county administration or county government could be. I don't think that we need to scale up a massive county government to do things, but there are opportunities that we have talked about over the last decade, which would be improvements to what is currently the system the sheriffs operate in. Going specifically to the problem statements and solutions for it. Number one, just briefly restating the problem: communities don't feel safe when an elected official has committed a crime against the victim or against the department. If we have, I come from a county where I was hired and the sheriff was embezzling. The sheriff who hired me bought a banjo, took her family to Florida, did a variety of things. I was starting in that environment and it was awful. I actually joined the Air National Guard because that was a vacation from the dysfunction. Boot camp is not a vacation, I want to be clear, but that's the point of frustration as a new employee into a department with dysfunction I had. My county voters learned very quickly that the sheriff that they elect is a critical position. They saw the damage that could be caused. We had a stellar organization that was brought to shambles. And then it took about 10 years to rebuild it with grit, hard work, blood, tears, you name it. So knowing that we've had issues that have affected local communities, I know that the voters have woken up. In some cases, it might have been too late, and I'm sorry that that's the case. But there is a solution, which is impeachment. I understand the problems of impeachment. We've talked about it for probably 300 years, and maybe the opportunity here is, can we fix that system so that it's not a problem? That is one introductory solution. The next is when we talk about sheriffs, we generally are operating without training or support. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that we're operating without law enforcement training. All 14 sheriffs currently are certified by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council's law enforcement officers. That's not management training. That's not saying what responsibilities we have to carry law enforcement liability insurance, how to manage workers' compensation insurance, how to hire effective people, how to eliminate ineffective people from our hiring processes or people we don't want. It is done by the judgment of the person that the voters selected. These are all things that can be trained. We don't have that resource. An opportunity for that is to create a position with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. I'm going to just make up a title, call it what you want. We're calling it the Deputy Director of Sheriffs. This person could help formulate model policies that sheriffs could adopt, best practices based on how sheriffs in Vermont and recognized national best practices operate. We could have a person who develops that, because when I say I need a bonus policy, what needs to go into a bonus policy? If I don't have any training on policy development, how can I be expected to craft that policy? I can reach out to an attorney. Sometimes they understand it, sometimes they don't. So at the end of the day, we see an opportunity that a person familiar with how sheriff's offices operate could help provide resources to the sheriffs, could help manage some of the issues that we deal with, could help educate us on the state code of ethics, which my understanding is sheriffs are not currently under their purview of, but it's a possibility. I don't think we'd be opposed to some form of code of ethics that sheriffs are bound to, whether the state code of ethics, a separate system, whatever that may be. One opportunity that we have that is currently, I won't say problematic, but certainly a constraint, is to create what we call the Sheriff's Oversight Commission. This is modeled on an existing organization for the state police called the State Police Advisory Commission. I think you may have even seen some recent media where the SPAC spoke out publicly regarding an issue. And they are a civilian body They are appointed to fill the roles to advise the Commissioner of Public Safety as it pertains to discipline. As currently required under Title 20, sheriffs are required to have what's called an effective internal affairs program. It's what determines how we investigate misconduct. And then there's a civilian body that needs to be established who advises the sheriff. We do this locally. But when I have a complaint that comes in that needs to be investigated against one of my deputies, I don't have those resources either. So I have to do it myself or tap one of my already overburdened staff members to pick up yet an additional duty. If we could have an organization such as the Sheriff's Oversight Commission who has the ability to handle these internal investigations for sheriffs, that takes a load off of me to ensure a full, fair, impartial investigation is done. It could be reviewed by an oversight committee who could say broadly for the whole state, we feel that this conduct is appropriate or inappropriate. That I have an opportunity as the agency head to say, based on the advice of the Oversight Commission, we're referring to this to the Criminal Justice Council professional regulation process. So these tools already exist. We just don't really have the resources to pull it together except by the sheer effort that each sheriff puts in. There's an opportunity. Title 24 includes language with regards to what occurs when a sheriff is in prison. Now, we know that the sheriff is a constitutional office. We know that the sheriff cannot be removed from the office except by being eliminated by the voters or by impeachment. But we have a law that says the sheriff can't function as the sheriff when they're in jail. And that's where the high bailiff comes in and exercises the office. There's an opportunity where the high bailiff or another effective individual could come in when the sheriff has had probable cause found against them in a court. We have one instance of that. And there's a question as to whether or not, I guess that's a consideration for the body. Do we want to have a sheriff who's been charged but not found guilty of a crime to have a pause? We have that exist in other formats of law enforcement in the state. Suspensions with or without pay, those occur. There's reasons for either. Suspension with pay is often not a punitive measure. There's a variety of employment law that goes into supporting why you would do that. Suspension without pay might be indicative of a finding from, say, the Criminal Justice Council that there has been due process against this person, and we want to stop that pay from happening. The written testimony that we provided does have possible language. I crafted it myself. I'm not an attorney. I'm sure someone can massage it better than what I did. But at the end of the day, we want to be able to say we're doing a good job. And when somebody steps out of line, there's an opportunity for the public to have trust with what the process is. I don't think that occurs right now. Before I move on to the next prompt, Tim, is there any questions I can answer on this?
So you've laid some pretty big ideas on the table, and I appreciate that. Like that is what I was hoping would happen today. That we would take what's in S17 and talk about what I think many of us have considered the kind of real problems affecting public trust. That when a law enforcement leader, sheriff, that isn't in the accountability structure of something like the state police or even a municipal law enforcement agency where they answer to a select board or city council, et cetera, that the sheriff presents a unique thing when there is a problem, this criminal charge. And so what you're saying is that the association would support some version of having there be, with appropriate due process, the ability to suspend a sheriff from duty through a court proceeding if there was a criminal finding or at least probable cause.
Yes.
Okay. Other things I wanted to just touch on and then I'll open it up to the committee. So you had suggested the idea of having an advisory or oversight committee similar to what the state police have. is it important in terms of the process of evaluating that to have it be separate from something like the Criminal Justice Council? I think what I'm getting at is it important for us to form some other committee that's specific to sheriffs, or can we try to have those duties and that accountability happen in the context of the Criminal Justice Council?
So as currently written, the Sheriff's Oversight Commission exists but 14 times. Each county is required to have it, and they then deliver it to the Criminal Justice Council. So what we're proposing is eliminate 14 versions, establish one version that's able to advise all sheriffs. And so we see a consistent rollout across the state, which I think is a consistent message that law enforcement has heard on a variety of policies for the last 5-10 years. With that, it also comes with a component that allows for the ability to have trained investigators who do internal affairs investigations. That is a skill set into itself. I don't just pick any investigator to do that. There's a variety of employment law that goes into it. There's differences between criminal investigations and employment investigations. So we want to make sure that not only is the process followed, which applies to either of those investigations, but we also want to make sure that employment law is followed, which is entirely separate from law enforcement and criminal investigation.
Representative.
Excellent suggestions. The thing that we're talking about right now borders on the charter change that we just saw in Burlington, where citizens are looking for the same type of oversight, and just inappropriate to have a bunch of yahoos come in and pass judgment. So if we start to look at that trail, State Police Advisory has always been an excellent example. I thought maybe we should at least consider, and it'll be pushed back on, expanding that into something similar to what each county does with like a CUSI or something like that. Be able to drag investigators in from other departments, just an assignment. Doesn't make sense to have 50 from a cost or a personnel basis.
One thing I will say is that a collaboration between the chiefs and the sheriffs in the state, we created I think the municipal sheriff's internal investigations group. This is unfunded. This is all of us recognizing we need trained investigators, but at one point I needed to tap that group for an investigation, and the investigator came from Montpelier. It's a 2-hour drive to Windham County. So I appreciated the 3 trips that he made down for the investigation. I appreciated the 8 hours, roughly 8 hours each time the investigator came down. That's 8 hours away from the community that's paying him to do his job. That's not fair to Montpelier. But he was very good, and it was a very quality investigation. That's what we want.
Other questions about Sheriff Anderson's testimony so far? Great. Sure, we'll have more.
I think that is the biggest nut to crack. It's that first problem statement. I think the next 2 problem statements are easier to crack, but we probably need more time. Not because they're hard. I just know that time's running out, and we have a study proposed in S17 as written, and it already covers those to a degree. So problem statement number 2, statutory construct of where sheriffs fall within governance and funding is incredibly complex, leading to frustration when services are needed and aren't available. We've become a catch-all for everything because we're not constrained by bureaucracy. If you call me, in fact, I just received a call from a local hospital saying, for those of you not aware, we just had an axe murder in Brattleboro, I think a week ago. It closed several of our homeless shelters for 4 weeks, and now they're being displaced into our community. And the hospital is anticipating some of that displacement will be there, and they're concerned about the safety of their staff. Now, I know the General Assembly has under consideration right now a bill about safety of healthcare workers. And the hospital's asking, can you do this? They're calling me because other agencies don't have the flexibility to say, yeah, we'll just be there. We do. It's often why you see the sheriff be the stopgap. We're under contract with an organization who attempted to contract with the municipality for the same exact work. After 4 weeks, the municipality said, we just can no longer do this. So they called me and we picked up the next 4 months. Because that's what we do. We fill gaps. My agency, Sheriff Marcoux' agency, Lamoille County, and a number of other sheriff's offices across the state support the Department of Children and Families. We support the Agency of Department of Corrections. We support Department of Mental Health. We're supporting municipalities with backfill. We did the congregate living during COVID. We're generally, as a National Guard member, I like to say that the sheriffs are the National Guard of law enforcement in the state. You call us when you have a hole. And we're just going to show up. We're going to bring chainsaws. We're going to bring sandbags. We're going to build whatever we need to stop the problem. So the problem in this is that, in part, we belong to ourselves. We are this self-constrained business enterprise that is able to be flexible to those needs. We are in part funded by the county, but only for our building, only for our electricity, only for some insurances, but not all insurances. We are in part supported by the state, but only for up to 2 deputies if a department is assigned those state transport deputies. Through this, there's often the finger pointing of, well, who's responsible for that? The state often says, we're not paying for that. That's not our responsibility, because it's not. Because the law doesn't require the state to provide those things, and that's okay. But then the thought is, well, the county is going to support it, but the county has prescriptive law of what they can and cannot do. And so while there is language that says the county can pay for things like retirement, there's not language that says I can employ a deputy. And that was one of the things captured in a Supreme Court case called Stowe v. Lamoille. Won't dive too deep into that other than to say it exists. And it's very restrictive on how counties can fund us. So while there's all this language of things they're permitted to do, it's all tied to something they can't do. There's a variety of interpretations of the law. And so if you look at 14 county budgets, you're going to find 14 interpretations of how sheriff's departments are funded. And so my county doesn't pay for the internet because that's not prescribed in law. But it seems kind of appropriate that we have the internet these days. So where are we paying for that? Well, I signed a contract to host some server equipment, which pays my internet bill. That's the way we covered it. We're trying to be creative, and there's benefit to that creativity, but in some cases there may also be detriment. So trying to come up with solutions to how sheriffs are expected to be. Right now, the system is operating exactly as the prior General Assembly designed it. It really is. If there's a desire for us to be doing something different, we need it explained. I mean, we need a definition, and it doesn't necessarily have to be law, but there does need to be the delineation or the enabling, just as there has been for other organizations in the state. There's not much language for the state police in the creation of the state police. You'll see the Department of Public Safety is responsible for promoting the general policing of the state of Vermont and for search and rescue operations. Does that describe what the state police does in your mind? And that's not so much the issue. The issue is that they're funded to do the things they're doing. We're not. Contracts, me being creative and finding someone who wants to pay for my internet is how we are doing it. So coming up with ways that we can consider regionalized services. We're seeing fire and EMS and law enforcement services across the state become crippled, either because of staffing or lack of resources. BLCT, they've testified in the Senate. I'm sure you'll hear from them again. We're not seeing an increase in police departments. We're seeing a decrease. My agency has more contracts with towns for law enforcement, I think, in my entire career, because towns are saying we need more. They're just not getting it. So I see opportunity to create better services for Vermont by improving some of the systems that underlie. They're not significant leaps. They're not significant funding issues. It's just a different way to allocate those funds. And then problem statement number 3, how sheriffs are compensated. I'm sure everyone has read an article about the 5%. First thing I want to say, it's not a revenue stream. It's an allowed expense. It's an allowed expense that says the sheriff can be compensated for administering contracts. We will see in different organizations in the state when, let's say that the Department of Public Safety got a grant, they'll hire a person to administer the grant. That's normal because the commissioner already has a job that has a pay that's been determined by the Department of Human Resources, that's been negotiated, that's been worked out based on the responsibilities the commissioner is already responsible for. The sheriff has none of that. And so if I take on no contracts, I receive my state salary, I do my state functions, there's no issue there, I'm compensated. That's a fair assessment. When a person like Sheriff Marcoux is running a public safety answering point, he's running a dispatch center, he's providing law enforcement for several towns that he's not obligated to do, but he did because either he inherited it, he identified it as a public safety need in his community. Should he still be continued to pay that state salary when he's doing more? I don't think the 5% language briefs well. People hear it and say, that just sounds weird. I understand that. But it is a system that says, if you're going to step up to the plate and do more for a community, more for the state, support these entities, it does actually kind of work fairly. It's just not well understood. There's concerns about how it's regulated. When we came in to testify on it, we said, let's put a guardrail on it. Let's put an upper cap on what the 5% is. Our thought was tie it to a position within the state police that it could not exceed that person's pay. I'll say the colonel because he has the same responsibilities as me. His certification has the same risk as mine. If I fail to do something and the council takes action on it, generally agency heads are responsible for the same things, except I'll also note I don't have the Department of Human Resources. I don't have risk management. I don't have a team of attorneys who answer my various questions. That's all done by me and the work that I have to do through professional services I can engage. So to that end, I would actually submit that while we don't supervise as many people as the state police, we have the same burden of responsibility and oftentimes more burden. So that's why I submit the colonel or the colonel's pay as that line. Most sheriffs won't come close to that line. My contract revenue was about $1.1 million in 2022. So 5% of that is $50,000. That's still under what the colonel makes. If I have $5 million of revenue, well, we didn't see a single sheriff pull anywhere near that. In fact, generally that was an internal premise that that sheriffs who had larger contracts took into account was we shouldn't be paid more than these other professionals that we are of similar, similar mindset, similar function, similar duties. So that's been happening. A guardrail such as that made sense. Senate Appropriations recommended a 50% of the base salary. It's not quite what we wanted, but it's close. And at least it makes it a little more tolerable, I think, to Vermonters to say, well, that just makes sense to us, as it's already a construct for commissioners in the state. What we did not like was that there's an expiration of the 5%, which is 2 years from now. The 5% will go away, which basically says there's going to be a pay cut coming in 2 years. But there's no promise of actually fixing the underlying compensation system. We're just going to talk about it. So our preference would be, if the Senate Appropriations language is considered, eliminate the expiration. If there's a desire to change the 5% compensation, do it in tandem, work together to cut the 5%, but also fairly compensate sheriffs. Compensate them for the work they're doing. Don't compensate them for the work they're not doing. It's not fair to pay someone for a job they're not doing. I got that. The sheriffs agree with that. We don't necessarily have the system, which is why we encourage studying it. We encourage not cutting the system, which could then cause a variety of follow-on effects, simply because as sheriffs, we're accepting not only the administrative responsibility, but also the legal liability. The sheriff is the only law enforcement agency head in the state that is personally responsible for their deputies' malfeasance. The colonel's not responsible, the chief of police is not responsible, the commissioner, no one has the same personal responsibility. My house is at risk if my deputy stops the wrong car. If the deputy enters the wrong house, that's on me. So why do I expose myself to the risk? That's the sheriff's concern with the changes about compensation.
Statement, maybe a question in there, but I like the analogy, Sheriff, that you used on the fact that having been in the National Guard, that you're the National Guard of the police of Vermont, and that makes a lot of sense. That is true. I spoke with one of your peers just this morning, in fact, about the work you brought up, the extra work you do, like DCF transports, you do Department of Mental Health transports, you do, and as I put my selectman hat on from my town, our local police department does not do that work. So I see you, like you said, bringing in the chainsaws, bringing in the sandbags. I never looked at that. I think it's a great analogy. So there is a service provided there. As far as the compensation piece that you were just speaking to, I'm not being accusatory or pointing fingers at anybody, but it seemed like some other testimony we got would lead one to believe that you all were just taking in gobs of money and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year potentially in some situations. And I'm thinking I'm not hearing that it's a far cry from that, but that you're being compensated extra for the extra tasks you're taking on. True statement, is that what I just heard from you?
Yes.
And I believe, if I'm doing the math right, I don't think there's a single sheriff in the state that's making more than $200,000 a year, are they? They're probably not even close.
To the best of my knowledge, no.
Okay, thank you.
So Sheriff Anderson, in S17, there are some pieces around maintaining the 5% in a separate fund and some pieces like that would provide even if we were to say take a different path, would provide probably a greater level of transparency and accountability through the audits. And I'm wondering, if the Sheriff's Association is supportive in being a little bit more transparent, so to ease public's concern about the use of those funds. I think the general concern that I have is that the absent an overarching statewide policy about how those funds are allowed to be used, that some of the reports that we've seen with bonuses have been in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I think we're going to hear some more about that. And we received the memo from the new Caledonia sheriff about that one incident most recently. But I'm just wondering, it seems like if there's a big cash balance on hand because of the accrual of those funds, that a sheriff can use those funds as they want to right now without really any oversight, accountability about that the flexibility of it allows for large sums of, what most people would consider public funds to be used at the discretion of the sheriff, which a lot of times it seems like they get used in a reasonable way. But some of these cases have definitely raised some public concerns. So I'm wondering if some of these limitations are supported by the Sheriff's Association, but the hard, cap and the wind down is really the challenge.
So the language in S17 as written is we raise concern that it is, and I testified to it last week, that is so, I'm going to say micromanaging, that we actually, I don't have the ability to pay my insurance because it says only 5% can be used for overhead and not my insurance, my retirement. And my retirement's 3 times my 5%. So how do I actually work that out? The Sheriff's Association, I think the easiest thing that we would recommend is return to the original language and then add the guardrail, the cap. That makes sense. It's understood. If there's a desire for transparency, requires part of the sheriff's audits to report the 5% expended as part of the audit. Put it right in the report. I don't know why it's not there already. I was told 5 years ago it used to be. I couldn't find truth to that. Not to say it's not, but I just couldn't find any supporting evidence that it was. But that's one thing I was told, is that it used to be, and we don't really know why it disappeared. Our 5% expenditures are already subject to public records requests. So I don't see the reason why we would be opposed to it. And generally speaking, I mean, you might not have heard testimony from Sheriff Marcoux, but Sheriff Marcoux's been doing this for 20 some odd years. His 5% is different than mine. I'll let him testify to his if he'd like. But at the end of the day, the reason mine isn't is because you also heard me say, when we came out of COVID, we were hurting for money. My department needs the money. I don't need to get paid. I'm living a life that is sustainable. I'm okay not getting paid if it means my department's improving. If there's an opportunity 5 years from now to say, you know what, we just busted our backs for the last 5 years, and I take some compensation for that, I'm not opposed to that. And I'm happy to say that to anyone and have the argument of what is my input worth? People say, well, why wouldn't you do that? My office manager, I just hired a new office manager. She said, it's very kind of you to return this to the department. I said, it's not kind, it's responsible. Sheriffs are generally responsible. We've had some instances where there's been issues, but if we look over the last 30 years, generally that's not the case. I would submit with the Caledonia Sheriff, the memo that you received, I read it yesterday. The memo you received, you'll see that some of their deputies, their total compensation, that's not sick time, that's retirement, that's healthcare, that's base salary, that's overtime, is less than $50,000 for many of them. I can't imagine living in Vermont right now on that. I mean, we've seen prices of milk go up significantly, price of a sandwich go up significantly. One of the deputies, my understanding is when he received the bonus from the Caledonia Sheriff, he fixed his roof that had a hole in it because he couldn't afford to do that. In some cases, we have deputies who were working below the poverty line. Is that what we want in law enforcement?
Representative Nugent?
Just kind of getting my head around the whole structure that exists and the one that you're proposing. That makes me think that if, instead of perhaps like a specific number in the legislation, if there was an oversight, commission board or something that could look at the overall compensation across the state, and then also look at it with like a salary survey or some kind of compensation survey, that might be more helpful and more responsive to the needs that we're looking at. Kind of similar to how other organizations do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a question that I would follow up on to Sheriff Anderson with that is, so that right now, the statutory base salary compensation for sheriffs is in the it's like 94,000 and change, right? And so the ability to use the allowable expenses to increase that, and many of the sheriffs do, it sounds like some of them don't, that it's at your discretion, is the kind of flexibility that we have built into the current system. What's the kind of range of sheriff's compensation? Do you have a sense of what that is right now?
So my understanding is that the highest was approximately $160,000, including the state salary. I didn't do public records requests to every sheriff's office. I called around and said, what did you get paid? And I'm taking that at the face value. But my understanding is the highest was about $160,000, including the state salary. What I'll also say is that it's the flexibility that allows us to step up with a phone call on Friday night at 10 p.m. saying, can you be here Saturday morning? And we figure that out. That's what gets us there, is the flexibility.
And you had suggested pegging the potential cap to something like what a colonel in the state police, and what's that salary approximately? Do you know that number off the top of your head?
I believe it's about $160,000, $159,000 in 2022. So I'm not sure what the 23 number is.
But it's in the mid hundreds.
Correct.
Okay. Representative Morgan, you had your hand.
Yes, Sheriff, were you folks paid to stay home during COVID?
Mine were not.
Okay.
So there's an issue during COVID, which is that we were not eligible for the payroll protection program. We're only eligible for FEMA funds, which pays overtime. It doesn't pay currently funded positions, which from the perspective of the federal government, our deputies are funded. But because they're funded by contracts, when the contracts were eliminated, the positions were fundamentally eliminated. There was the CARES funding, which provided some relief to agencies. I think my agency was able to capture back about $250,000 of essentially payroll. That took some time and some work from the General Assembly to allow the county to actually float me a loan that was paid back to the county. And then the ARPA funds were, there was $110 million of ARPA funds set aside for counties, which the administration and our federal delegation worked with the federal government to municipalities. So while the sheriffs and the counties said, we don't need $110 million, we do have needs, we saw nothing. And so that's where a constraint for us has been, is that we're seeing municipalities offer sign-on bonuses that are coming from ARPA funds. It's an allowable use of ARPA funds. Mm-hmm. We're competing against that with zero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of one of the things I was driving at. I don't think you all were just allowed to summarily sit home. And I'm not knocking anybody else that did and collect X amount of unemployment, X amount of the kicker money, et cetera. That wasn't a luxury. I don't know if that's a good word to use, but I can't think of a better one at the moment. But you didn't have that ability to make the abilities better to do, and your first responders to a degree in your communities.
So another issue, and when I testified last week, I mentioned I had an option of keeping my staff working or laying them off. I'm what's called a reimbursable employer in the state of Vermont, which means if someone is on unemployment, as an employer, I refund the state of Vermont the amount of money collected on unemployment. So I can keep people working and the money goes down. I can lay them off, the money still goes down because I'm paying back the state of Vermont for the unemployment collected. Based on how the federal funds were allocated for people on unemployment, some of my deputies would have made more money being unemployed than staying employed. And while that would have been great for them, and I'd be happy for them only to the extent that they're doing well, I'm paying the state back. So the department is doing even worse. I had deputies ask me to lay them off so that they could collect more money. I said no, because it wasn't responsible. And I'd rather have them working and providing public safety, despite the fact that we were headed straight for the red. And it was but for the grace of the work of former Senator Jeanette White, her committee in government operations, Representative Maricki, and this committee in 2020, that we were able to get language that allowed the county to keep my office open. All of which was reimbursed by the federal government. So there's some broken pieces to the system when we're a business that's expected to fend for itself, but then also tied with this government boat anchor that doesn't allow us access to the things that actually kept government running through COVID.
Yep, thank you. That's kind of what I was driving at.
So that might be a good segue, since we have the former senator next up and on Zoom. But is there anything else you want to leave us with before we continue this conversation today, Sheriff Hank?
I just thank you for the time, and I'm happy to come back anytime to answer any questions or respond to emails. I appreciate the time that you've given me to speak today. Thank you.
So we do have former Senator White is on. Jeanette, are you able to hear us? Yeah, great to see you.
I'm here.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Great, and we are hearing you loud and clear. Well, welcome. I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself, and you had asked for some time to give your thoughts about S17 and this issue, and appreciate you being here.
I did, thank you. So I have to say that sitting here has given me a lot of sympathy for witnesses. Not that you necessarily are terrifying, but it is terrifying sitting here, even virtually. The job of the witness is to give you the best information to try to convince you that I know what I'm talking about and that you should pay attention to me. So how much or how little to say, it is terrifying here. For me, on this particular topic, I could talk forever, or I could be really brief. So maybe somewhere in between. But now I understand why Frank Bryan, if you know who he was a UVM political science professor, used to speaking to classes and groups all the time. When he came in to testify at one point, he said his palms were sweating and he was terrified. And now I understand why, because I'm there right now. So for those of you who don't know me, I was in the Senate for 20 years representing Windham County and chaired Senate Government Operations for 16 of those years. This is a topic that we have worked on for many years in Senate Government Operations. And for over those years, with the support from law enforcement and input from them, many positive changes have been made. We now have level 2 and level 3 officers instead of full-time and part-time. If you don't know about that, the Criminal Justice Council can talk to you about that. And the Criminal Justice Council has adopted categories of offenses and potential sanctions. That's just to name a couple of the changes that have been made. These have all been done working with law enforcement. S17 to me feels like it's doing to rather than with, and that's my concern with this bill. So my comments on the bill, and it is very hard to follow Sheriff Anderson here because he really does know what he's talking about. And my comments are mainly from a lay perspective. So take that with a grain of salt, if you will, but I will try to convince you. So I'm going to be a little more specific about the bill itself than Sheriff Anderson was. So here I go. So section 1, what I heard from the Criminal Justice Council, and I'm sure you'll hear from Chris Burkell, that the addition of H and I were not necessary. They aren't necessarily harmful, but they might cause confusion. And remember, this applies to all law enforcement officers. It was put in response to some sheriff's actions, but it applies to all law enforcement officers. And they felt it might cause some confusion, but that it wasn't necessarily harmful. Section 2 and 3, which is the auditor's section, it all makes sense. And as the sheriff said, they're happy to comply with them, and it seems reasonable. We just have to remember that they have to be able to cover an unexpected audit. They budget for their regular audits, but there is no money budgeted for unexpected audits. And here's just a little aside, and I will probably disagree here with my former colleague, Tim Ash, who now works for the auditor's office. But when an audit is done and it's presented, ask questions. For example, a $400,000 bonus that's bandied around and sounds just horrible. I mean, who would give $400,000 bonuses to people? However, my understanding, and I think you said that you just got a note from the Caledonia County Sheriff, but my understanding is that it was meant to cover healthcare and retirement costs and lack of raises for 2 years. So when you hear something like that, ask the questions. Don't just look at the outcome. Find out what the reasons are that it happened in the first place. And it is the kind of thing that makes for good fodder for the media and gets people stirred up. Section 4, I'm not sure why there's a separate conflict of interest policy and ethics violations policies for sheriffs. Those of you who were around last year remember that for the past probably 4 years, the General Assembly worked really hard to pass a state code of ethics that includes a conflict of interest policy. I don't know that the sheriffs and the transport deputies, because they're paid by the state, are covered by that. But it does seem to me that instead of having a completely separate policy, for them to just extend the state code of ethics, which includes the conflict of interest policy, to the whole sheriff's department. And Christina Sivert would be good to talk to about that. Section 5, and this is the issue that has clearly caused a lot of consternation. It is, again, one of those things that gets people whipped up and without even understanding what it's about. And I know that you've already heard this, but it seems that this was put into statute because it was a number of years ago, because it was easier to do this than to increase the sheriff's salaries. Increasing salaries in the legislature is hard to do, and so they put in this 5%. But I believe that the whole issue is largely misunderstood. And there are a couple of discrete issues here. First is the salary issue itself. As you heard before, in the large scheme of things, sheriffs are underpaid. And as an aside, and I know, again, you heard this from Sheriff Anderson, they are the only law enforcement officers who are personally responsible for the actions of their deputies. That's a pretty heavy load to think of. If your deputies do the wrong thing and get sued, you can also be sued for their actions. That's and yet their pay is comparably less than other law enforcement people. The second issue is the amount of the admin fee. Everyone who writes a contract or a grant is allowed to have an admin fee. This is often 10 to 20%. Sometimes the amount is dictated by the grantor, sometimes by the grantee. I deal with grants all the time and contracts, and this is very common. In fact, I would guess that the state itself probably takes up to 20% on many of its contracts and grants. So nowhere does the statute tell the Agency of Human Services how much it can charge for an admin fee. That's ridiculous. We wouldn't even think about doing that. And yet we impose that on the sheriffs. If you look up admin fees, you'll find that it covers many things: writing the grants, the contract. In the sheriff's case, it means meeting with the contracting agency, all the select boards around the county, supervising, preparing the budget, doing reports, hiring grant managers, etc. So not only have we defined what the sheriffs can have as an admin fee, how much, but we've defined what they can use it for. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the statutes either. We don't tell the Agency of Human Services how they can use their admin fees. It's ridiculous. That's technical talk, ridiculous. And that leads to the third issue, the use of the admin fee, and I just talked about that. So 5A in the bill is a partial 2-year solution, but it will sunset. The hope is that the salary issue will be addressed by the study and the 5% issue would just go away. However, when 5A sunset, if Section 5 remains, it will still limit what the admin fee can be used for. For example, it can't be used to pay a grants manager or pay for benefits. So how are these things to be covered by the sheriff's office? So as I said, we wouldn't tell the Agency of Human Services how to use their admin fee. I'm sorry, but you can't hire a grants manager, or you can't pay for benefits for your people. Oftentimes they hire whole new staff members with their grant. Section 6 also addresses the work schedule. How detailed will this be, and who will review and who will have access to them? If the public has access, will it raise questions? For example, if a sheriff meets with school groups or individuals? Is that a legitimate use of their time or not? If I have breakfast with Sheriff Anderson, does he have to record that? And can somebody then make a big issue about it because it's in his time card? So who will have access to this work schedule? It doesn't say anything about it at all. It just says they have to keep a record of it. And we know that once we've created a record under public records law, it's subject to a public records request. With Section 6 also requires sheriffs to retrieve belongings for people who have a relief from abuse order, and they're not allowed to charge. My understanding is that there's currently a system that it's not defined by statute, but it's a system that's been worked out with the municipal police departments, the sheriffs, and the Vermont State Police for dealing with this issue. And I don't know that we need to define it in statute. And if we do, if everybody agrees, that's okay. But the question is, how would sheriffs be compensated for this? And I do agree that it should not be paid for by the victim. They should not be paying for it. But this could be a very complicated, this isn't just a matter of going out to somebody's house and collecting a few papers or a few sweaters. This could be a very volatile situation. It could involve, so it might have to involve 2 deputies. And it could take a couple of days because you're talking about real serious issues here. So there needs to be some way of compensating sheriffs for doing this. If we didn't define how they could use, if they didn't have a 5% limit on their admin fees, they could maybe use some of the money from there if we didn't tell them that they couldn't, but we do. But I'd also like to address what is not in this bill. As I understand it, the impetus for the bill was to address rogue sheriffs. And there are rogue sheriffs, and there always have been. As Sheriff Anderson talked about, we had a rogue sheriff in Windham County a number of years ago, and that wasn't the most recent sheriff, just so that you don't think that that's who it was. But so they need to be dealt with. But as far as I can tell, this bill does nothing to contain rogue sheriffs or to curb their actions. The way to do that is to beef up the sanctions for sheriffs that misbehave. I'm pretty sure it is not unconstitutional to put sanctions on them. It can be done through the Criminal Justice Council in collaboration with the Sheriff's Oversight Committee. And the Sheriff's Association has already made some suggestions that may be able to provide some of that oversight. They've submitted at least 4 or 5 suggestions, but they need to be considered. They also talked about a whistleblower protection and public records responsibility. So here I have a couple specific suggestions. Extend the state code of ethics to the sheriff's departments, to the whole department. Leave the statute the way it is currently exists concerning the 5% until the salary study is done. Or better yet, get rid of the whole section on that and just allow the sheriffs to have an admin fee of whatever the contracting agency and the sheriff's department work out. If you leave it in the statute the way it is, you can add language that only allows the sheriff's salary to be increased by 50%. That's the way it is for many other positions that exist in the Pay Act. They're allowed to increase up to 50% of the salary in order to attract the people that they need. Don't prohibit the 5% to be used to cover benefits. Some deputies need it for that, and then they could cover those benefits and extra deputies. Carefully define who will review and have access to the sheriff's time cards. I'm not sure what they're calling them here, but I would suggest that only the Department of Sheriffs and state's attorneys have access to those. figure out a way to pay for time spent helping those with relief from abuse orders, work with the Sheriff's Association and the Criminal Justice Council to develop and impose sanctions on rogue sheriffs. And I know you've already heard some of those. Sheriffs are an important part of our law enforcement system. The structure under which they operate is flawed, but the way to address that is to work with them to help change the system, not to make the system even more difficult to work with. Thank you. And I don't know if you have any questions or anything, and I really realized I had nothing new to say, but I just wanted to voice my concern about this bill.
Well, I appreciate you bringing your 20 years of expertise to bear and offering us some recommendations and feedback. One of the questions that I would ask is that I think we made some progress with the Code of Ethics. It doesn't currently apply to sheriffs, is my understanding. The ability for the Ethics Commission to actually take action and do sanctions is pretty limited. So I'm wondering, how much that would really address the issue of rogue sheriffs in your mind, just that piece alone.
Thank you. I don't think it would address that. But in this bill, you see that there's a whole separate conflict of interest policy for the sheriffs. And the state code of ethics has a very specific conflict of interest policy. So you don't need to have a separate one. And it alone would do nothing to curb rogue sheriffs. That's true. But if you're going to have a conflict of interest policy for them, make it the same as other state officers and employees. Don't have a separate one for them. The way to curb the rogue sheriffs isn't addressed at all in this bill. Not one single thing in here will do that. And that's why I would suggest that you work with the Criminal Justice Council and the Sheriff's Association to figure out what those sanctions are, how you can impose those sanctions for sheriffs at different levels of rogueness, if that's what you want to call it. Because right now, it only addresses sheriffs that are imprisoned, but you can expand that, and that's the way to curb rogue sheriffs, not through this bill, which does nothing to do that.
We've taken some pretty significant testimony from legislative counsel in regard to what our powers are to remove a sheriff from office, suspend, decertify, like if there's a professional qualification that we could put on. And I think the feedback we've gotten to date is that there are constitutional concerns there. And I'm wondering, you've delved into these issues for a long time. If you feel like there's a place where we can go in terms of strengthening those sanctions, it sounds like your opinion is that we could.
So first of all, there are levels of sanctions against their law enforcement capabilities. So under the criminal justice system, they can be sanctioned or decertified from having a law enforcement certification. If they are decertified, they can no longer perform law enforcement activities as the sheriff. They could continue to perform their administrative duties as the sheriff. And so you are right that there is no way short of impeachment to remove a sheriff from office, but there are ways to curb their responsibilities and their activities. And that is not unconstitutional. It already says that if they're imprisoned, you can do a certain thing. So if they're charged, you can move that down the ladder so that they don't have to be imprisoned in order for you to take actions. And that's through the Criminal Justice Council. That is around their law enforcement duties. And if you decertify a sheriff, what that sheriff is left with is their managerial duties. And you're right, you can't remove them from office, but you can sanction them and you can punish them for actions. You can't remove them from office. It is interesting that what I learned is that there have been a few attempts at impeachment. And the reason they weren't successful, or what I've heard is that the main reason they weren't successful after talking to people is that the House is the one that prepares the impeachment. So the House acts like the grand jury. You take the testimony and say, is there enough evidence here to impeach them? And then the Senate acts as the jury, and they try them. But you decide whether there's enough evidence to impeach. And what has happened in the past is that because there is no process for doing an impeachment, the defense attorneys for those sheriffs that they were trying to impeach came in and just blew it all apart, because the House has no, or the General Assembly has no process in place. Like who's going to lead it? Is it the Speaker of the House? Do they hire attorneys? Is there a special committee that looks at it? There is no process. And so you could improve the impeachment process, which would potentially make it easier to remove someone from office through impeachment. And that's true for every constitutional officer. They can only be removed from office by impeachment or be unelected. So you might want to think about setting up a process for how impeachment would work if it ever came to that again.
Other questions for Jeanette? Former Senator White.
No,
I got a really hard time referring to you as Jeanette in here. Representative Hooper has a question.
I don't have a question, but I think I have your history that you bring forward is invaluable here, Jeanette, and hello. And I appreciate it a lot. It's first time we heard something on this bill, I said it sounded like somebody was looking to get a rope in a tree. And now it just seems like somebody has picked a big scab off something and it's going to take a long time to put it back on. I think as far as I've heard so far, the details that you have elaborated on make this pretty much a non-starter. So thanks for shedding a lot of good light.
Well, so I want to say that I think that the testimony we've heard from both Chair Vanderson and former Senator White recognizes that there are some of the things that are in S17 actually would work and could be expanded on. I think the real pieces of concern seem to mostly be around Section 5, if I'm understanding your testimony correctly.
Well, I think that there are issues I think that the audit section is fine. Just figure out a way to pay for it. I think that the statewide contract or a contract for court security at the same rate for everybody is a good idea. But the bill as a whole, and the study is good. There are some good things in the study, but the rest of it, I don't see any need for it. And I think it's, as I said, I think it is mainly doing to the sheriffs as opposed to with the sheriffs. And there are ways of dealing with rogue sheriffs, and this does not do it at all. So if that was the intent of the bill, it doesn't do it. And I know you've heard about, as I think Representative Morgan, was it you that said that you heard that some sheriffs are just raking it in. They're just
Yes, ma'am.
and I can tell you that I know down here, even working with our former sheriff, over the years, he plowed most of that money back into the department, and he did some really creative and exciting things. And our current sheriff is doing the same thing. And you, sometime aside from this bill, you should talk to him about some of the things he's doing with DCF. and with corrections, it is groundbreaking. So we need to be very careful that we're not actually making it harder for the sheriffs to function. And I resent the fact that we have kind of made them, we seem to have defined them as a bunch of yahoos out there who are running around and just scalping the public. And I don't know why you would think that there should be that this 5% is public funds necessarily that should be only used in a certain way. If the state of Vermont, if Agency of Human Services gets a grant from the Mental Health Department of Mental Health, Federal Department of Mental Health, that's public funds. So shouldn't we tell them how to use that admin money? And some of this is not public funds. So does the 5% also address contracts with, say, Mount Snow to provide law enforcement up there? I don't know.
Representative Morgan.
I would agree with the member from Burlington, what he said a moment ago, that I guess I would say that in my humble opinion, it's just me, one person speaking, that this bill is not ready for prime time. And I appreciate what he said and what you're saying, former Senator White. There are some components of it that I think are okay, but I don't think it's ready to, in my opinion, to go any much further than like the study components of it I could support personally. Beyond that, I don't, exactly as you said, ma'am, I don't think, essentially, you're struggling with the words, I guess maybe demonizing some of these people is fair to, because of a couple of bad apples. It's still 10-90 rule. You 10% wreck it for the other 90 that are good in any cross section of what we see in this world as a general rule, I've come to find in life. But so I think we have to be careful and mindful and thoughtful of that. But again, that is my 0.02 or my 2 cents on the whole matter.
Well, I think before I go to you, Representative Hango, we'll have time to have a committee discussion about the elements of the bill, but just in response to that, there are things in here I think we absolutely need to move forward. And there are also things that I brought people in who I knew would raise some significant concerns this morning. Mm-hmm. We're also going to be having more testimony about some of the specific issues that we heard about a few weeks ago that we need to bring to light that need to be addressed. Mm-hmm. So I think the public is expecting us to move something forward that actually does deal with the issues that are on their mind. So we're going to be working hard on this for the next couple of weeks. Representative Hango.
Thank you. I don't have a question, just a comment and a thank you, Senator White. It's so nice to see you again. I really appreciate your input in this because you have so much institutional knowledge about this. And it helps me because being from Franklin County, I'm obviously a little bit tormented by this subject. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate your wisdom and certainly will take your commentary to heart. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy anytime you want to pick my brain about anything, either individually or whatever. I would not have, had you asked me 50 years ago if this was a topic that I would be in here speaking on this in this manner, I would have told you were crazy. Because I was one of those radical hippies, and that was me, and I would not have been here. But I think that we have really good law enforcement people in Vermont, and we have some bad people. But for the most part, we have really good law enforcement, and the sheriff's offices are one of those, I think, really necessary institutions that we need to work toward reform, but we need to work toward real reform that respects the positions and the offices instead of making it more difficult for them and dissing them or demonizing them, as Representative Morgan says.
Senator White, before you go, I think what your testimony has brought to light is that it comes back to something that has been a theme for me, which is that it seems like the structure we have of electing sheriffs and having limited transparency, I think really the only transparency in their books is the audits that are performed. And that structure seems to make us totally dependent on the character of the individual who's elected for how that office goes. And we've been really lucky and had some fantastic law enforcement leaders. And we also have had a few people, including in very recent history, that have faced serious criminal charges, been convicted of crimes, done things that any, as you said, like the Agency of Human Services would never be allowed to do in their fiscal oversight structure. So I'm wondering if you think, heading in the direction of more accountability, more transparency and oversight, to Sheriff Anderson's point, is a good direction for us to go.
I think that sheriffs having a statewide sheriff's oversight committee, probably under the Department of Deputies and state's attorneys and sheriffs, might not be a bad idea. And also creating the position so that there's a position in that department to deal particularly with sheriffs, because currently they are mostly oriented toward state's attorneys, I think. And you'll hear from John Campbell and Annie Noonan. I think they're on your list. But I think that we also need to be really careful when we're talking about oversight, about what we're talking about with oversight. And there are many forms of oversight. And I know that there are some departments and some people who are of the belief that there should be oversight committees for police departments, sheriff's offices, maybe even the state police, that can actually investigate and sanction them. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about that, because I think it was Representative Hooper who said that you could get a lot of, I think he called them yahoos, who don't understand the pressures that law enforcement work under, and the split-second decisions they have to make, and the responsibility to their communities. So you need to be very careful when you're talking about oversight, about how that oversight stretches and where it can go, because you do have the criminal justice council that deals with and there's a whole list. And if you haven't heard from Chris Brickell yet,
we've done two significant bills that dealt with conduct categorization, and we're deep in it with the Vermont Criminal Justice Council this year.
Okay, good. Oh, good. Okay, I didn't know that you were doing that. So yeah, so there is already oversight around their law enforcement activities, and so just be really careful what you mean when you talk about oversight.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been a frustration to folks in Franklin County, to Representative Hango's point, is that even a criminal charge, even when there's probable cause, and even when a complaint has been brought before the Criminal Justice Council, it's very hard for them with their current system to suspend a sheriff, to suspend their certification even.
Yeah, it is. And that's why I think that the Sheriff's Association had presented, I think it was 4 or 5 different levels of those sanctions. And so I think that you could work with the Sheriff's Association and the Criminal Justice Council, and they could together, I think, could come up with some levels of sanction that are before suspension and what you do at different levels, when somebody's been charged, when they've been indicted, when they've been adjudicated, so different levels.
Well, thank you very much, Jeanette. Representative Mrowicki has A question?
Just have to say hi.
We'll have breakfast soon, Mike.
Yeah.
Check your email.
Okay.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us this morning. Committee, I want to give us all a 15-minute break.
Bye.
We're going to be hearing from
Thank you.
Yep.
the folks from the judiciary about some of the issues that are pertinent to them that are in S17 after we break. So I appreciate everybody's patience with the long discussion this morning. And we'll be back here. Let's come back at 10:40. So we'll adjourn and go off.